One thing that keeps me up at night is what would have happened if we were in the other timeline. What if January 6th succeeded? What if shaman guy with the horns and the cadre of lonely people with the anti-Semitic messages all over them succeeded in enacting violence on Mike Pence, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, maybe Nancy Pelosi? What would have happened? Part of why I find this useful as an intellectual exercise is because it gives me an empathic insight into what people on the far right might be thinking, or even just like center right, if they actually believed this. Like the fear that I would be feeling about an illegitimate presidency stolen by force is the fear that some of them are feeling with an illegitimate presidency that would they perceive to be an illegitimate stolen by force. On the one hand, it does feel like the last election was a rebuke of the big lie. A lot of big lie candidates lost pretty heavily. Part of that is because I think people are coming around to the fact that like there just hasn't been any evidence. We've been looking and there hasn't been any evidence. And the second reason is because Republicans are largely picking like largely unpopular policies. Kansas voted blue on abortion in a lot of ways. Ohio, I think, or Michigan voted blue. These policies are so out there that people are just like, no, this is just too far. But I also think part of what is happening is that Republicans, a lot of Republicans, are actually smarter than a lot of liberals think. I think they know that he's a liar, and that's okay with them. The spectacle of him saying outrageous things is entertaining enough that it is able to supersede their perception that he's contradicting himself repeatedly. My favorite example of this is the COVID vaccine. He wants to take credit for it because it was done during his administration and he wants political points, but he also can't admit that it's good because he's got anti-vax people in his constituency. So he tries to do these verbal, gymnastics, these intellectual gymnastics, and I think people are smart enough to see through that. When I imagine what I would do if the coup succeeded, if January 6th succeeded, one of the things that pops into my head is what would need to happen in order for me to be convinced that Trump actually won. That's a question that I find useful in thinking through what's going on in the brains of people on the other side who don't perceive him to be a liar, which I think is, I don't know what the numbers are. One historical model that I barely remember because I was quite young is the Bush versus Gore election in the year 2000. I remember as a child hearing on the news about, oh, well, they're not sure who's going to win. It was this or this, do a recount. And we went through this process and eventually just settled on a fact of the matter and moved on. If January 6th had succeeded, I would probably be protesting, but I also would be waiting for the process to play out, expecting the checks and balances of the world of democracy to, eventually arrive at the right answer. And I would be waiting for a smoking gun moment that vindicated my worldview. And if none of those smoking gun moments ever occurred, I would, like in the case of 2000 with Bush versus Gore, I would eventually just be forced to concede there isn't any evidence. But the reality is, flipping out of this fantasy world where it had succeeded, we have seen smoking gun moment after smoking gun moment. All of this evidence is appearing that Trump tried to steal the election. There's literally a bajillion there's several smoking gun moments that have occurred. The call where he said, could you find me some more votes? Just find me some more votes. That to me is a smoking gun moment in favor of recognizing that he lost. The alternative example of this, all the details emerging of this fake electors scheme. There are a lot of details that this was not just some spurious thing. It was a coordinated effort to undermine the election results. I would like to think that as a rational person, if we lived in this universe where January 6th succeeded, and then a bunch of evidence came out that Biden had actually, in fact, stolen the election, that I would eventually come around, that the country would eventually come around. I would like to believe that. I don't know that that is true, because we're not as rational as we think we are, and I think it's important to remember that. But as you know, we don't live in a world where it seems like facts and truth matter. We watched a president talk about injecting bleach into his veins, and then people did it and then got hurt and died. We watched the president stare at an eclipse without eye protection as if his strongman powers could overcome dangerously high energy photons hitting his retina. We live in what seems to be a post-truth world. I'm not okay with this, but I don't know what button to press so that we can again reach a point where we care about a shared sense of reality and truth and facts. But there is one model that I think if we come to understand, it will help us understand the post-truth, the mechanisms of the post-truth world that we're in, and it's this. From Safiya Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, she defines a concept of algorithmic radicalization that I think we don't even need defined. As soon as I say it, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Algorithmic radicalization, for the sake of defining it, is when you look for something that you want to see on the internet, Google shows it to you. Google, as she explains over and over again, is not a truth company, it is an advertising company. And in order to keep you clicking, it will show you the things that you want to see. She gives an example of a notorious mass shooter who was radicalized in this way, made a couple of searches, and then fell down a rabbit hole. A lot of us know people who have fallen down these rabbit holes. This book came out in 2018. I personally am like a little bit behind on the research. I'm trying to catch up. I'm doing my best. An earlier concept comes from Cathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, in 2016, on page 23, where she talks, that's the wrong page. Nope, it's the right page. A key component of this suffering is the pernicious feedback loop. Algorithmic feedback loops are a thing that we have witnessed vastly change the political terrain, the intellectual terrain, and the culture war that we live in. More than any election in the past, we are fighting political battles in an attention economy. Billions of dollars are spent by companies to keep your attention scrolling and looking and seeing and scrolling and looking and watching advertisements and buying products. It's part of the modern economic landscape. I make videos for a living. This is my bread and butter. So whether you want to call it algorithmic radicalization or algorithmic feedback loops, we are watching polarization grow in front of our eyes, in part because of personalized media environments. And as we're seeing with folks like South African Daddy's Money Elon Musk, people rise to the top of this attention economy by buying power associated with bots. We've got evidence with Cambridge Analytica. I've got other videos about this. Or by being as outrageous as possible. Trump is the first post-truth president, and he's also the first president in the algorithmic feedback media landscape. Sometimes you could watch him do this live over the course of a couple of weeks. He would try out different ideas like lock him up or, COVID denial or like making fun of people with disabilities. He tried that and it didn't resonate, and so he kind of stopped doing it. Trump didn't have ideals that he was pushing people towards. He was a algorithmic feedback loop incarnate becoming a president. Put differently, we no longer live in a political environment where people say, these are my ideals and I would like to work towards them. We live in a political environment of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and Donald Trump, i.e., we wait for the crowd to speak and then decide those are our values. Actually, we care about Jewish space lasers and we care about COVID denial and we care about all these different bonkers things, because we are living in an algorithmic radicalization, algorithmic feedback loop media world. And the thing that takes up the most airtime in the attention economy is not nuance, shout out to my new podcast called Too Much Nuance, but rage and anger and quick sound bites and punchy back and forths. Those are the things that take up attention. We saw this on the Republican debate stage recently. Vivek Ramaswamy probably doesn't believe half the stuff he's saying. He just knows that if he says bonkers out there stuff with conviction, it will get coverage, and that coverage will get amplified in the social media feedback loop environment that we're in. When you put a microphone too close to a speaker, it just starts screeching. It's amplifying itself, and it's not making meaningful noise. The post-truth moment that we are in is the moral and intellectual equivalent of a microphone being put next to a political speaker. Fear-mongering about the 1619 Project or about trans people or about climate change is the thing that screeches loudest. And so it's the thing that Republicans believe for the sake of maintaining power, because as we mentioned before, most of their policies are largely unpopular. Okay. I've been talking for too long. I hope I've explained a couple of things that are useful to you. If you're still here, consider Patreon. My name's Charlie. Does that make sense to me? And I'll talk to you in the next one.